percentage of the illegal heroin. Our armies over there do nothing about it. That all gets spent on their armies to fight our armies. It's like, when you get into it, it's really crazy stuff. So the pharmaceutical industry have got massive power, I've realised, because, you know, people will sell their house to get rid of their pain. You know, it's the thing everyone will just give away everything for. If they can get pain-free, they're going to just give you anything. So I think people over time have realised that. The pharmaceutical industry, it looks to me like they wrapped up the whole medication thing. It's just business. They pretty much write the doctor's course at university where you do 2 days on nutrition, which I find totally crazy. You know, it was the hippies and our drugs that woke us all up to organic food and permaculture and whole food and not eating processed food and the danger of sugar, which is like this 1% of the whole thing. It's just totally unbalanced. I think cancer loves sugar, like diabetes loves sugar. You know, like obesity loves sugar. Sugar's a big issue, I realise, in our diet. Anyway, Zane will talk later to you about diet, but for me it's really simple. You've got to eat whole food, as close to, you know, the source as it comes, and if you can do organic, it's, you know, it's going to make total sense. Total sense to me. The chemicals are in everything, and they're a serious drama. So most of us up here have got our own gardens. It's a huge thing. I would encourage everyone to dig a bit of dirt and plant some stuff. Anyway, so I've got to nimbin about 30 years ago. I've kind of realised with other people how huge the drug war is on this community. We're like a refugee camp from the war on drugs. And heaps of the people living in Nimbin or around Nimbin have got a habit with an illegal drug, and it's incredibly expensive, and we're so judged on it. You know, I feel like this whole community's been so judged for such a long time and so wrongly. The Reefer Madness campaign, the lies about cannabis are extraordinary. I mean, you know, I'm kind of a good guy who wants to believe the government isn't going to lie to you that much, and I realise that, you know, they've been hoodwinked. They believe it. The cops believe it. All sorts of people are believing, you know, cannabis will drive you crazy or drive you mad or turn you into a lunatic. And there's a couple of things happened under Prohibition that will help that. For a start, it really, you know, should be grown outdoors in the sun, cannabis, and probably 80–90% of Australia's crop is grown indoors in a bath full of chemicals under a light by organised crime, who doesn't really care about the product. They just want a big fat bud that's going to knock you out. So in the last 50 years, the well-meaning hippies have bred plants that had the high THC content, which is the psychoactive thing. So we bred out a lot, or down a lot, the second most prevalent cannabinoid, which is CBD, cannabidiol. And that's the kind of balancer, the antipsychotic, the anti-stress one. So the more we bred THC and got CBD, the more I think there are some problems for some people keeping their feet on the ground and working out what's imagination and what's real. So over time, as Prohibition pushed pot indoors, created these skunk, high THC, you know, zombie grasses, people call it. The war on drugs has actually created some of the problems people did think cannabis had, but it hasn't at all. You know, in the whole history of cannabis use, and it's like, it's the earliest plant everyone was using. It makes the unique, strong, long fibre, so it makes the best books, the best clothes. The word canvas comes from cannabis. All the Bibles and banknotes were printed on cannabis because it lasted so long. So that was another vested interest, which was wood chip, wanted to knock cannabis out of the market. The cotton industry wanted to knock cannabis out. So Prohibition, when it came in the 30s, coincided with the pharmaceutical industry arriving and the petrochemical industry arriving. So you know, Henry Ford had that great quote, anything you can make from hydrocarbons, you can make from carbohydrates. And we're just discovering that again now. You know, in the hemp embassy uptown, we've got these bowls and things made out of 100% hemp. Just the stalk ground up into a powder, and then water added so it's a paste made into a shape and it sets itself. It's an extraordinary plant. And Mercedes have been making their doors out of it for 20 years. So it's got this massive potential that's been buried under prohibition and under the reefer madness. Because I find when I talk to police or government or politicians, they still believe those stories, or they still... You know, John Howard it was a lot, who got some figures from the psychiatric wards or the nut houses, wherever, where people were being admitted using drugs. And cannabis is uniquely fat soluble, so it stays in your blood for a month or two, whereas all other drugs will pass through really quickly. It's one of its really unique properties. So when you go into hospital, or when you have a car accident and go to hospital, everyone gets their blood tested. So all these extraordinary figures come up. Cannabis comes up everywhere. You know, if I got tested in 2 months and hadn't had a smoke, I'd still register cannabis. So it was John Howard who first got all these distorted figures. Oh, cannabis is the problem. The Victorian Health Minister announced that 10% of the beds in Victorian hospitals are due to cannabis. And I contacted him, and sure enough, it was the blood tests. You know, there's things that are just so misunderstood about pot. Anyway, no one has ever died in the history of cannabis use, which is bigger than any other plant on the planet. It was probably the most grown plant on the planet 200 years ago. It's incredibly safe. And in a way that's enabled people like us at the Hemp Embassy, or, you know, homemade people who have learned, lots of us have learned how to grow and breed cannabis and use it for 30, 40, 50 years now. It's an extraordinary amount of knowledge, which basically the government's trying to wipe out, so we're going to license, you know, big companies, pretty much pharmaceutical companies or associated with them. You know, we'll license you to do the growing, we'll ignore all this cottage industry which has grown up. But you'll hear more about that later from Andrew Gavasilis. So I could sort of rave on to you heaps about the history of it, but it's just now that I'm realising there's such a force to stop cannabis getting legal. They will lose a fortune, the pharmaceutical industry. Already in the 20-odd states in America, they've got medical marijuana. Now, some of them, like California, have had it for 20 years. So the figures are emerging already. You know, suicides are way down, car accidents are way down, because there's less drinking. And the use of pharmaceutical drugs on a lot of things is way down, like epilepsy, like Parkinson's, like cancer treatments. So the figures are there to already frighten them. If they let us grow a plant in the backyard, in our backyard, no one makes any money. That's a big drama. So they're adamant about not letting people grow their own. They're adamant about putting it into some kind of mainstream system. And I think that, you know, the next 5 or 10 years will sort a lot of us out, you know, whether we're going to get locked up or we have to go and buy through the chemist, which is their plan at the moment. And the chemist knows nothing about it. Most doctors know nothing about it. So, you know, it's an interesting point now where they're trying to educate the doctors and educate this whole new world. All of us who have been to do with cannabis for 50 years are going to get sidelined. That's their plan. So you'll hear about bits of that during the day. Anyway, I don't want to talk anymore. I'm going to introduce you to Carol Ireland, who I want to learn about too. So she's the CEO of Epilepsy Action Australia, but she's also on the federal government's Medical Cannabis Advisory Council, is that right? As a patient rep. And something pricked up my ears, she said, in Sydney, where, you know, she goes to these meetings and they just hear all the negative stuff about us. And, you know, you realise there's a serious propaganda machine operating there. I always remember hearing when the Obama health plan was happening in America, the pharmaceutical companies had 2 lobbyists in Washington for every senator, full-time. And people in Canberra told me it's really similar. The pharmaceutical industry spends a lot of energy just keeping the propaganda happening. They're not going to let pot free very easily at all. So I really appreciate your open-mindedness coming today, and I would recommend you just stay open-minded and, you know, look up for yourself. Google is amazing on cannabis. Most of the people who invented the internet were stoners, you know. Steve Jobs smoked a joint every day of his life. So it's pretty interesting because, you know, up until 1,000 years ago it was called God's gift in the East because it's a spiritual thing. And If something takes your pain away and makes you feel good, you know, we might call it medicine, science, other people might call it spiritual, but both count, I reckon. Anyway, enough of me. Happy to introduce you to Carol, who's going to tell us her story, and she both... Who's talking later? We're making it up as we go. So Dr. Andrew Catalaris is here. I so appreciate you coming, Doc. Good on you. He's been totally groundbreaking on treating epilepsy, which is a bit of the focus today. I also hope we have a bit of a panel of parents of epileptic children. So if there's anyone here who is happy to talk, and it's scary. You know, dogs can come and take your kids away. So anyone who wants to talk and happy to, just come and talk to me and see me. But meanwhile, I'm introducing Carol, and she'll tell us her story, which is a pretty fast learning curve, I reckon. Here.
Hi everyone. First of all, Michael, you might be interested to hear, I was interviewed yesterday for local Lismore radio. And, ABC? Yeah, I think it was ABC. And one of the really interesting questions I thought that they asked me was, well, you must do a lot of talking around the place, you know, and I do. Melbourne, Sydney, and, you know, various other places, regional as well as metropolitan. But you're going to Nimbin. Now, you know, people in Nimbin, that town, that has a little bit of a reputation. How do you think they'll be different? And I said, well, I don't think they'll be different at all. What you're talking about here is people that have a range of health conditions, you know, sometimes illnesses and so on, and they want to know about the medicinal properties of cannabis the same as everyone else. So I don't think they're different at all. I know what you're saying, Michael. I hear you in terms of the reputation. It's interesting. So it's just as you know, far away as, or as close as Lismore that you're fighting that kind of reputation. Now, I've got, I think, almost multiple personality disorder in terms of the roles that I play. And I'll just sort of fill you in on a couple of those first and then tell you about the journey. So, as Michael said, I'm on this council. It's a council of people who advise the Federal Health Minister, appointed by the Federal Health Minister. Very interesting to serve on that committee. You'll appreciate that a lot of what's discussed is confidential, and I signed a confidentiality agreement, and so I can't go into a lot of detail about that. But it's a very interesting group, and many of them are seasoned professionals and very knowledgeable about cannabis. But what are they knowledgeable about? They're knowledgeable about cannabis as an addiction. You know, that's what they're knowledgeable about. So it's quite an interesting perspective that comes through in that. And it's also interesting being a consumer representative, an advocate, if you like, of patients, because I ask a lot of questions about the current patients and how we're going to help them, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later, but it's a real problem. Before I go on, I want to just ask if people in the room are familiar with epilepsy. How many of you think you know it pretty well? Yeah, quite a few. Okay, so almost everybody knows somebody with epilepsy or has heard of it. They know about it, but they don't know a lot about the detail. And I'm just going to throw in a couple of facts so you're familiar with why I've become interested at all. Around 250,000 people in Australia are diagnosed right now with epilepsy. In our lifetimes, 800,000 of us will be diagnosed with epilepsy. And for around 60 to 70% of those people, they'll get reasonable seizure control through the currently available anti-epileptic medications. But 30 to 40% won't, and they go on to have what we call intractable epilepsy or medication-resistant epilepsy, and they can have many, many seizures, sometimes hundreds in a day, every single day. So imagine life if you were having seizures every single day and hundreds of them. You obviously can't get on with daily life. And for little children, many of whom are affected by this kind of intractable epilepsy, those continuing seizures are affecting their already compromised brains. You know, they're becoming less and less capable, they're losing their cognitive abilities as more and more brain damage happens. So I think straight away, you know, you'll start to see why am I interested in cannabis. Some years ago, It was from the United States. A young girl called Charlotte Figge, and you've probably heard of Charlotte's Web, was actually given a CBD or a cannabis medication and had some fairly amazing results. And that's been repeated in a number of places now, to the point where those people, particularly parents in Australia who have these kids with intractable epilepsy, saw hope. Now, just a couple of other things when I talk about my multiple personality disorder. I also serve on the steering committee for the New South Wales government trials of Cannabidiol in paediatric epilepsy. So, you know, the non-demonised cannabinoid. And I say that because THC has been somewhat demonised. Those trials, again, I can't say a huge amount, but those trials are ongoing, and thankfully we've got the first lot of research that says, there's something in this, it's actually having an impact, and that's fairly new. Mind you, that research, for us to know everything we need to know about cannabis, is going to take years and years and years and years. I was just talking to a colleague of mine down the front here, Dr. Deb, and we were just saying we're on the very edge. We're only just starting to learn about cannabis. It probably has many, many, many applications. I'm also a member of the advisory board for the Lambert Initiative. And if you haven't heard about that, there was a fellow called Barry Lambert who a few years ago gave $34 million to Sydney University to actually explore, investigate the applications of cannabis to various health conditions. And again, it's going to take years. It's very exciting work, and already there's some great stuff out, but I heard one of the principals say, well, in 10 years we hope we've got, 1 to 3 really good cannabinoid medicines come through. Well, let me tell you, parents with children with intractable epilepsy don't have 10 years to wait. So that's a real issue. Another thing I'm involved with, and this is just to get my declarations out, Michael, so all of the hats are shown. I've also just recently, with 3 colleagues, established a medical cannabis council. And it's an attempt to try and pull the industry together, try to advocate for consumers. So we'll see how we go. But, there are many of us wearing many hats. What makes me really, really sad is that we're not all moving as one and in the one direction. But, hey, that's an idealist view too. That's the reality of the situation. So coming back to epilepsy, the other thing I just wanted to ask you is, has anybody heard of SUDEP? I think I see 2 hands. 3 hands? Yep. SUDEP is sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. Who's heard of SIDS? There you go. Almost everybody. So SUDEP is like SIDS. We don't know why it happens, but somebody who has epilepsy will pass away suddenly. They've got a diagnosis of epilepsy, they pass away, not through a seizure, they just die, usually in their sleep. More people die as a result of SUDEP than die as a result of SIDS. Yet, people don't know about it, they don't understand about it. Those most at risk of SUDEP are people who can't control their seizures. You see the link? And also, young people, particularly young males, are particularly vulnerable. So epilepsy is a darn serious condition with some, dire impacts. And anything that will help in that situation is what I'm about as the CEO of Epilepsy Action Australia. For anyone here who has epilepsy, I just want to say I've got travelling with me Lisa Todd down in front row, who's our clinical nurse consultant. And very happy to sort of have a chat with you individually in breaks and so on and so on. But Michael asked me to tell you about my journey, so I'm just going to do that briefly. Go back maybe 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, when I first heard that marijuana was going to be looked at as a treatment option for epilepsy, I reacted probably like a whole lot of people in the community at that time. What? That marijuana only does harm. It only does harm. I've got one of my sons here sitting down in the front row, and he and my other sons think it's hilarious that Mum's actually a cannabis advocate. Because, you know, hey, I raised these boys and, you know, they certainly heard plenty from me along the line about that. So, yeah, I think they're quite amused, especially when mum turns up on television, you know, talking about cannabis and advocating for it. So that's where I was at 4 years ago. I spoke to Lisa, our clinical nurse consultant, and other nurses in the organisation, and they had a similar reaction. You know, this is really dangerous and the evidence is not there. It's just not there, and, you know, we need to write fact sheets and warn people. So fast track a year or two. And, you know, we did write the fact sheets and we did warn people, but fast track a year or two, and I'd actually met a whole range of people who were using illicit cannabis to treat their epilepsy, particularly families who had little children, sometimes very little, but up through to their teens, and they were accessing the black market to treat epilepsy. I knew some of those kids pre and post the cannabis. You know, just use a couple of examples, you know. Young fellow who was having up to 500 seizures in a day, some clinical, in other words, you could see them, some subclinical, you could only see it through their EEG. But, you know, just constant seizures. They were non-verbal, couldn't communicate, they were non-mobile, you know, wheelchair bound. In some cases, we also knew some who were tube fed, you know, not able to be feeding themselves and so on. But some of these kids, seeing them pre-cannabis and seeing them post-cannabis was nothing short of amazing. You know, kids who went from 500 seizures a day to going to school, riding bikes, you know, verbal, mobile, developing, probably still with some some deficits caused by brain damage because of the constant seizures beforehand. The other thing was, while cannabis was part of the story, the other part of the story was actually taking them off the anti-epileptic medications, the legal anti-epileptic medications they were on. Because when they were on those medications, and sometimes it was desperate, you know, they'd tried 5 and 6 and 7 different medications to try and stop the seizures. Even if they stopped the seizures, which many of them didn't, the side effects were horrendous. So if you can think about families that are giving their kids 35 tablets in a day, and they're getting steroids and they're getting benzodiazepine as well as their anti-epileptic medications, these kids were, in the words of one parent, legally stoned. You know, and they had been for years. So we're not talking about just general epilepsy here, we're talking about the really tough end of the spectrum where medical, traditional medicine, has not been able to help. And yet something was going on here, you know, something was going on with cannabis. We have other clients that have, you know, they're very sick kids. They may not have a great prognosis, but what's happened with cannabis use is that their quality of life has improved. And if they'd had cannabis earlier, one wonders, you know, would they be in the dire straits that they're in now? So as I said, to fast track, you've got someone who's saying, oh, you know, this is dangerous, and I guess I, like a lot of people, had been affected by the old reefer madness and the 80 years of prohibition, and had, you know, certainly tried to warn my sons, and just really negative to somebody who said, hey, there's something in this. And I'm not just talking about meeting 1 or 2 or 3 families, I'm talking about dozens and dozens of families in every state of Australia, and everyone we talked to had, you know, this same report of, I'm giving my child cannabis and this is the result, and invariably it was positive impact in their life. So I developed a little bit of a mantra, and I say it all the time, and I'm going to say it again here, but if you were a parent of a child that had this intractable epilepsy, you'd tried everything, you'd followed all the traditional medical routes and nothing had helped. You'd be desperate, you'd probably try anything. But you've taken the first risk, you're giving your child some unknown substance other than knowing that it's cannabis derived. So you're taking a risk. Most of us don't take risks with our children. Secondly, you're breaking the law. And many of the people we're talking about here are loving parents, law-abiding parents, people who are even in, you know, in armed forces, in the police force and so on, and they're taking these risks. They're actually doing this. And then they actually also tell you that it's having this amazing really good impact on the child in maybe they're seizure-free, but if they're not seizure-free, the severity and the frequency of the seizures have gone down. And my mantra, loving parents don't lie. Why would they say this? Why would they break the law? Why would they give their child something? Why would they report back there's an improvement? Loving parents don't lie. So you saw, certainly in me and Lisa and others, converts. There's something in this. There's something in this, cannabis that is having an impact. And this is just for epilepsy. I mean, I've heard similar stories with many other health conditions, but this is just for epilepsy. So I started to get very involved in the medical pathways, the legal pathways, the regulatory pathways, anything that might help. And that's why I've got, this foot in one camp and another foot in another camp. It's actually anything that might help, then I'm willing to put my time and our organisation's time into. But sometimes I do get really, really disheartened. I mean, as Michael has alluded to, there are government pathways, there are pharmaceutical pathways, and that's the way that government is moving. And it's very slow, it's very, very slow, it's very complicated, and I'll come back to the fact that these families don't have a long time to wait. At the moment, to get a legal form of cannabis, there's a couple of pathways you can follow. You can actually apply under the government's special access scheme. You've got to have your doctors on board. There's got to be a doctor willing to give you a script, and you can apply and you can get one of the pharmaceutical forms of cannabis that's out there. It's extremely complicated to do that application, and you may not get a medicine that works. The doctors don't know anything about it. As Michael said, most of them have not been taught about the endocannabinoid system. It was discovered after many of them were even trained. So they don't know about the endocannabinoid system, they don't know about the various cannabinoids and how they impact on our body. And we're talking over 100 different cannabinoids out of the cannabis plant. As I said, we're just on the edge of really understanding what it can really do. So back to the medical pathways, I guess. Very, very difficult to, one, find a doctor who will prescribe, two, to find the right medication that's out there, and three, to get it into the country, and four, to pay for it. Because if you are lucky enough to get a doctor to prescribe it, it comes in, you might be looking at $100 or $150 a day to actually get the medicine that's required for your child. The other pathway to get cannabis, medical cannabis in Australia at the moment that's legal is through what is called Authorised Prescribers. So there are certain doctors that can apply to the federal government and they can be authorised to prescribe a medical cannabis product. To my knowledge, I mean, I've heard in the newspapers and heard at different presentations, well, there are 27 authorised prescribers in Australia already. Number one, that's a very low number for the population of Australia. But forget about that, because the 27 prescribers are mostly those who've been trained through clinical trials. So while it's said that they're an authorised prescriber, they've usually only learnt about one pharmaceutical medication. In the case of the New South Wales trials in Queensland, or the Compassionate Access Scheme that they've got going, it's a medication called Epidiolex, a CBD-based medication through a big pharma in the UK, and that's all they're prescribing. They're not prescribing a range of cannabinoids. And I come back now to the issue of THC and it being demonised. It's largely said in government circles, and certainly the doctors that I've talked to, that the compound we need to be looking at is CBD, cannabidiol. No psychoactive impact, anticonvulsive, that all sounds okay. However, number one, we actually know from people from overseas, we've talked to a lot of people overseas, manufacturing and prescribing and so on, that unless there's an element of THC, it's probably not going to work very well. So we're hearing that from all the people who've got experience overseas. Number two, we've actually been doing some work through the Lambert Initiative to have some of the illicit cannabinoids analysed. And what we hear is a lot of the people who think they're actually giving CBD aren't at all. and that things like THCA, the acid form of THC, is actually really, really important. It's probably going to be one of the medicines that we need to look at, and really the trials aren't even touching on that yet. So I won't talk a lot more, but I'm happy to take questions either now or later, or off the stage, in terms of what have we learnt about cannabis over the last few years. I'm happy to talk about the different pathways you might go through to get a legal cannabis and the difficulties that might be there. I wish that we'd actually known about cannabis, or not known about it, we've known about it forever. I wish that the movement had been able to start many, many years ago, so that people suffering with terrible illnesses and conditions now might be assisted rather than in 10 years or 15 years' time. Happy to talk to you about any of those things, or epilepsy itself. I wish that the whole cannabis movement could actually truly move as one, because I think we need to influence government. We need to bring research to the table, and I'm still hearing that the research isn't in there. It's just not there from the doctors, from the government. The research is not there. Well, I think there's heaps. And I think some of you will speak about that later. Unfortunately, a lot of what we've found is termed, and I hate the word now, anecdotal. Anecdotal rather than being the kind of research, randomised, double-blinded, placebo-based trials is what the doctors say they want. But I think there's a heck of a lot of evidence already that says that cannabis can and does have a positive impact on the lives of families. So thank you for your time. If there's any little insights in there, I hope they're useful. And I am happy to take questions. Michael, I don't know whether now or later or...
If someone's got a question now, can I ask, how do you imagine it's going to unfold with them trying to do their trials and get it legal? Are they going to turn a blind eye to all laymen providing, or how do you think that's going to go?
How do I think it's going to go, or how do I think it's happening right now? I think they are turning a blind eye, Michael. They are.
Certainly out of New South Wales, but I don't know about everywhere.
I think in some of the other states it's even worse. If I could put it that way. I think Queensland's probably the hardest at the moment. In New South Wales, they've taken what's called an almost amnesty-type approach. For people who don't know, if a family now is found to be giving their child cannabis, they usually will not be prosecuted unless they, like Michael Lambert, go into a police station and wave it in their faces. They'll usually not be arrested, not be prosecuted. But what is happening, of course, is compassionate suppliers are being identified, and they're the ones being prosecuted, which will cut off supplies to families. But no, I think I don't see any consideration in any of the committees that I'm on as to the knowledge that's already available amongst the current suppliers. I don't see any conversation or hear any conversation about that at all, I'm sorry to say. I do keep asking a question at the various committees I'm on, and I keep asking about transition for families. So from what I'm seeing at the moment in everything I'm participating in, it's straight down a pharmaceutical route with the kinds of trials that would normally be put in place and so on. Straight down that pharmaceutical route. Yet most of the people that we know through Epilepsy Action Australia are actually using one of these illicit products. So I keep asking, well, what would be the transition for those families to move from here to here? And there isn't an answer to that. And to actually move from that to a legal product at the moment, they cannot afford it. The costs are absolutely, hugely unaffordable. So there was another question. Tony? Okay, Tony's question was, with everything that's happening today, what would be the one obstacle that needs to be overcome? Depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about the end goal as being cannabis more readily available to everyone in the community, it's huge. There isn't one obstacle. It's huge, I think. And the only pathway that I could see, if that was the goal, would be political. That's the only pathway I would see. If we're talking about cannabis for medicinal use being available through the pharmaceutical pathways, through the legal pathways and so on, time and money. It's going to take a lot of time and it's going to be very costly. So it just depends what you see as the end goal. I think I saw another hand. Yeah?
What's your time frame for change in epilepsy?
When you say what's my time frame for change, if the question there too, I can interpret this a couple of ways. If the question there is when do I think everybody that could benefit from seizure control through cannabis through legal pathways, my desired time frame would be as soon as possible, but I think the reality is a decade or more. If that's the question, through the legal pathways, yeah. As I said, I've spoken to Lisa. Do you think that's right? Yeah. I've spoken to people who are doing their, pharmaceutical work and their research work, and they're right on the ball and they're doing it, and they're saying, well, within 10 years, and this comes back to my point, families, individuals can't wait 10 years. Anyone else? Yes.
I was just wondering, you were just saying that the information is out there, the research is done all over the world, there's all these facts, really facts out there from medical tests in wherever, in Spain, Italy, whatever. I can't believe that you're talking to people in your different roles in committees and everything who have some brains and they can't get the message that, the life is running away for these epileptic kids, etc., etc. And the parents, the whole role of being criminalized, being always living in fear while you have such a load on your life already by trying to make the best life possible for your child. So I can't believe that you're meeting all these so-called intelligent, very important people, and they can't see the urgency of this whole issue. And they're talking about a timeline of 10 years, where I've seen those people coming from all over, hundreds of kilometers away to come to this workshop here, because they hear about things. And then you go to Facebook or to some special website, you can read up every day, there's a new illness we can help by using cannabinoid or whatever THC cannabinoids mix, etc. It's just mind-boggling for me. How dare we as a Christian society let this shit happen?
I hear you.
I congratulate you for sitting there, and it's not a hippie like me or Michael speaking since 20-something years about this issue, but you. And so I wonder what they are saying to you. How can they look into your eyes and say, yeah, well, 10 years time?
Yeah, I hear you, and it's certainly not easy to be a patient advocate at the moment. And for me, I think I'm in a fairly unique situation because I know many of the people that are suffering personally. I know them, and I see how difficult their lives are. And then I suit up and go and sit up in some office in Canberra and try and influence and try and work there. I think one of the problems we're facing, well, I'm going to say there's two problems we're facing, and one is the huge pharmaceutical drive and the money behind that industry. That I do believe that. The second thing I think we're facing, which is a real problem, is there's a belief in Australia that we have gold standard in medicine and medicine production and so on. That, Australia's just got the very best. Whether you believe it or not, that's certainly what I'm coming across at the level of researchers and doctors and government, that there's this gold standard in Australia. And in Australia, the way that a medicine is developed usually takes a long time. And you're starting in a test tube, a petri dish, and so on, and then you slowly moving into animal trials and then human trials. And so the medicines come about via chemistry and via the research arms, and then the doctors are told there's a new medication, here it is, and here is how you prescribe it, and this is what it will do. And one of the things I didn't know is that to say it's a medication that's successful doesn't even mean that the majority of people will get benefit. It means that some will, but doesn't even mean that. But most people are used to that in Australia. That's the normal pathway. what you've got here in Australia is something very, very different. You've got people who know the plant. You know, they've got to know the plant, some of you guys, and they've discovered that this plant does some pretty amazing things. And then you've got a consumer movement that is pushing the government and pushing, you know, the politicians to make moves and make moves fast. And those two things are kind of at odds. The doctors are not comfortable at all. They think things in the cannabis movement have, quote, moved way too fast. And we, you know, who know the patients and know the situations, are thinking this is agonisingly slow. But boy, it's hard to influence. I'm sorry, I saw one more hand there somewhere. Yes?
Look, I'm just curious. You do wear a lot of hats, and I take my hat off to you for the work that you do. But I'm curious, in this room there's a lot of experience in a lot of different things, but obviously in marijuana and growing and the medicinal side of it and the therapeutic, the whole box and dice of it here. Now, there are committees that you're on now. Would there be something wrong with you as a committee person, forming little subcommittees and using the knowledge base that you have here from groups like you have here and letting them form a little committee themselves? There must be people here with the knowledge that I don't have of the drugs that can share it with somebody who has similar knowledge of the drug, and between them, their minds can take another step forward and pass information to you anyway, which you can pass on to other people. They, because we are dealing with the entity, the beast that is and never was, right? The money, right? It rules the world, right? But we as men and women, right, as thinking beings and as creatures of God, right, we have a duty to ourselves and to our children. The governments run the world, this is the way of the world. But God made life. This is the way of life. Now I believe that these people between them can share something, and with another group of people like these people here in Nimbin, you could be in touch with them as well. And you, where you are, your arm could stretch to so many places. You could have so much information coming toward you, and then all these little groups that give you information, you then connect them together, and before you know where you are, you have formed the Australian Medical Marijuana Association Incorporated, because that's the name, it's not registered yet. But I feel that there's something you can do.
Yeah, on the one hand, I'm going to say, no, there's not any reason why I couldn't do that, on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm going to say, I'm employed as the CEO of Epilepsy Action Australia, and I don't necessarily have the time to actually be doing what you're doing, but what you're saying. But mind you, I sometimes say that I feel more like the CEO of the Medicinal Cannabis Association than I do of the Epilepsy Association. But I've got a balance in there. Having said that, I will continue to try and influence, and I'm really happy to talk to Michael. I mean, I'm here, standing on a stage in Nimbin. None of my counterparts are. And I've been at the last two Mardi Gras events, and I spoke at the last one. So I'm walking a fine line, if you know what I mean. It's a fine line to be able to be accepted there and also be here. But I think it's a valuable line, and it's worth walking a fine line. I'd be really open to talk to Michael about how I might be able to take some information and try and influence with it. I also met with someone yesterday, whose name I won't divulge, but a compassionate supplier who has tried to collect data. You know, and this is going to be really important in Australia, is not just that we say, hey, we know it works. You know, we've seen this anecdotal situation and we know it works. It might be enough for some of us, it's not going to be enough for the government and for the researchers and so on. So if we can collect some data, you know, on who's used what and what the impacts have been, then we've got a bit more of a chance. And so Lisa wasn't there yesterday, but in her absence I actually have allocated some of her time and some of mine to work with someone to try and collect data, and I'd be very happy to do that with people in Nimbin too. Oops, have we still got some time? Yeah. Yep. Yes. So the question was around the research and development that's going on overseas, particularly in Israel. But there's Israel, Netherlands, Germany, Canada, all up there, and others are all up there. They've all taken very different pathways, so none of them have gone exactly the same way. The only one that's really gone down the pathway of legalising cannabis or decriminalising cannabis is Canada. And when I asked the Canadians, how did they get to that place, it was actually through legal action. It was actually a couple of families, sort of went in and took out, class actions and various things. They got together and they won legal battles, which then forced the politicians and others to move. The others have also gone down pretty much a differing, but still a traditional medical kind of a pathway. They are looking at that research. As I said, you do get to hear some of that. In fact, the New South Wales government brought out somebody from Germany, Netherlands and Israel to one of its last symposiums. But you've still got this attitude of this is Australia, we've got our own pathways, the TGA and so on, and that's the pathway we're going. Back a couple of years ago there was a parliamentary inquiry and there was some suggestion that there actually be a medicinal cannabis area set up within government that just dealt with cannabis. And a lot of us spoke, Lisa and myself spoke, and tried to say, yeah, that would be a better way to go, but that wasn't the pathway chosen. The pathway chosen was to use the existing traditional pathways. So, through the Department of Health and the TGA, the Office of Drug Control and so on. So that was a, political/bureaucratic decision that was taken, unfortunately.
Obviously cannabis and marijuana, as you thought it wasn't illegal some time ago. And something happened that suddenly it became illegal. Has anybody drawn back, or to go back and re-evaluate the evidence and everything that was used at that time to say it's now illegal and try and debunk that or find why did we suddenly have it forced upon us that it's illegal to grow or take this? And I'll get all the facts why. And if those facts are all debunked and that sort of thing, surely it's going to make it easy to say, well, hey, we've just got it all wrong.
Yeah, that sounds like common sense, doesn't it?
We also have a word in LDNA.
Yeah. Well, it's we've got new things and expansion, the system's there. It's part of it.
Look, it absolutely is. Our bodies have an endocannabinoid system. We are set to receive cannabinoids. If we've got a deficiency in our endocannabinoid system, we're not going to be well. So I think that evidence is there. It's not well known. And I think we need to talk more and more about that. But there were probably people better placed than me to answer the first part of your question there. I would say that, and again, I was talking to my colleague down the front, Dr. Deb, and we were saying, well, the situation we're in now is not dissimilar to the situation 80 years ago when Prohibition came in. From what I understand, it was very political. And it was to do with money. And, I might let others sort of deal with this because I think they'll know more than me on that. But I don't think it's changed since way back then.
So, is Sista here? We've got another mic. No, it's just hard to hear questions a bit. Speaker.
Someone like you wouldn't be on TV
First of all, I'd say hippie-like or no hippie-like, we are all human beings and all equal. So, you know, hats off to all of my very warm friends in Nimbin. Love the hippie types. Secondly, there are powers that are sometimes bigger than what you suggest. So I do go on television. I was actually on ABC last week and supporting a couple of families who were saying things are difficult. But I don't get to decide when I go on television and when I don't, and I don't get to decide what's printed that I might say. And sometimes when I'm interviewed, some bits get up and some bits don't. I've had some really blatant things happen where, without going into the actual detail, it was something that the government announced at one stage and it was, yahoo, it's wonderful, isn't this great? And I was actually contacted and asked to make a comment, and I made a very lengthy comment because it wasn't as good as it sounded. And I made a really lengthy comment, and the only thing that got on that interview was Carol Island said there are 250,000 Australians with epilepsy. So, you know, I hear you, and we're not giving up. And I do have a bit of a fine line, as I said, to walk. I mean, what I don't want to do is say anything that then gets me thrown off a committee that I might be able to influence. You know, I've got to stay there, and therefore you walk the fine line. But you're right, between us all, we need to raise more awareness and just keep at it.
I thought her answer was right. You're talking common sense. I'll tell you what, there's not much common sense happening. It's all a big fight over money, really, and control. Yeah.
Steel industry that got up in arms and before got the power out of hemp and the petrochemicals, because you can run it on hemp oil and all that sort of thing.
Vested interests.
But all of that can be, all this can be debunked. Something that's stand up.
I think we've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah, I suppose, absolutely.
And I think we live in extraordinary times where there's a lot of stuff changing and politicians have huge agendas and the squeaky wheel gets the attention. And one of the problems we've had with being a protest for cannabis law reform, you ask, you know, who's going to come and protest cannabis law reform? It's like saying, all the criminals put their hands up, eh? So you don't get heaps of people. It's very tricky. So I want to ask Carol a really difficult question. Now she's admitted she's on this fine razor's edge. Because, you know, we get, honestly, hundreds of people.
I did love him.
Yeah, you'll see. I'm going to test her out. So, we're honestly getting hundreds of people a week coming to Nimbin. Because every time the government makes an announcement, it sounds like it's legal. We've got legal